tonight for this really great webinar, Artists, Writers in Your Yarra, a talk by Dr. Judith Buckrich. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. The Yarra River Association acknowledges that the lands and waterways of the Yarra catchment and beyond are the unceded territories of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. We pay our respect to their ancestors who cared for country since time began, and to all Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung community, to all the Kulin Nation, to all traditional owners who continue to speak and care for their country. We acknowledge that the river now called the Yarra has always been known as the Birrarung by its custodians. It's also my pleasure to introduce you to our host for tonight, Dr. Judith Buckrich. Bit of a background on Judith. She has a Bachelor of Education in Drama and Media Studies from Rusden College and a PhD from the University of Melbourne. She's very accomplished. Since 1991, she has written 13 histories and biographies of Melbourne people and places. She won a 2016 Victorian Community History Award for the Village of Ripponlea and the 2018 Fellowship of Australian Writers, Victoria Award for Non-Fiction for Acland Street, the Grand Lady of St Kilda. Since the 1970s, Judith has written her own one-woman shows, short stories, feature articles, and essays. She's worked as an editor and translator, taught writing at Deakin University, the Victorian Writers' Centre and Melbourne University Union, and curated exhibitions for the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, Museum of the Port of Melbourne, and the Prahran Mechanics Institute Victorian History Library. She has several entries in Remembering Melbourne and the Encyclopedia of Melbourne, for which she was an image researcher. She was also the president of the Melbourne Centre of Pen for 15 years and international chair of the Women Writers Committee of Pen from 2003 to 2009. She is the president of the Prahran Mechanics Institute Victoria History Library since 2018. And with that, I'd love to pass it on to Judith.
Thank you very much. All right, well, look, just carrying on from that, I just want to let everyone know that I'm covering the period from about 1837 to the 1960s. I'm not going back further than that because the way that the Woi-wurrung people lived and worked and did everything on the land is a work of art in itself, and there will be quite a lot devoted to that in the book that is forthcoming one day in about 4 years' time. But also I'm finishing in the 60s because already this talk is too long. I hope that we can squeeze in whatever it is. And I actually wanted to speak much more about the writers, but I just can't. Really, it needs to be about 3 different talks to cover the thing. But look, I'm starting with Robert Russell. This is his survey map of Melbourne. He was the original surveyor of Port Phillip, and I love this little map. It shows the vegetation. It shows the Salt Lake, which was called the Blue Lake, and there's been a book written about that. And it is really kind of the lovely sort of simple drawing that I enjoy. Now, Russell lived on the south side of the Yarra River. He was one of the very few people who lived on the other side of the Yarra at this stage in the very early period of Melbourne. For those who don't know, Melbourne was settled by Europeans in 1835. So in this very early period, he was one of the few people to have a house on the other side. And from there, he was a surveyor, but he was also really a painter all the time. He painted Melbourne all the time. So what we have from him coming up is kind of a rendition of what Melbourne looked like across from his house as time went on. So I'll just sort of start with that. Oh, this is also Melbourne in 1838. This is a map that was drawn for the great 1888 exhibition that was held in Melbourne to give people an idea of what the city was like. And you can see all the little boats in the Yarra there. And you can see how Elizabeth Street was like a creek. And there will be a lot of that about that in the book, but not in this talk. So we go on to, so this is Russell's 1837. many of these were painted much later, but he kind of has given each one a year so that we know approximately, you know, what we're looking at. But he's always got these gum trees, especially the one on the left, as an indication of where we're looking. So you have the falls there at the tree on the right, and going toward the other shore, you have those rocks. And that was where the falls was, where freshwater started. There was fresh water further upriver and then salt water downriver, which was one of the reasons why Melbourne was settled, was because we had this beautiful access to fresh water. This was his house, which I think too is kind of, you know, it's thatched roof, and obviously it's kind of a wattle and daub house, and he lived there for a long time. It was a very simple, he was a very humble man, but he loved nature and he loved living there. So here you have a rendition again of 1837 with some people crossing on the rocks. The rocks were used, the rocks at the falls were used by the Woiwurrung, and I imagine some Boonwurrung and some other Wurundjeri people, but also used by Europeans before there was any bridge. This is what they used to get across the river. And quite a few people died, sadly, trying to cross the river from the falls, some because they were silly and they were drunk and crossing the river, but others just tragically, including John Batman's son, who drowned in the river trying to cross it at the falls. I do like this painting because it's got a sort of little bit of an idea of the kind of shelter that the Woiwurrung people were using. And across the river, you can see how there's already been quite a lot of things cleared, and, you know, people have fenced off a little bit of a paddock. But on the other hand, there's still a tent there on the left-hand side. So this is 1838, and already you can see there's quite a few more houses. He's drawn in, and you can see these images if you want to see them yourself. They're in the State Library of Victoria. They're digitised, so you can just have a good look at them yourself. And he's got the name of the people who live in the various different houses written on the painting. And this is 1844. So, you know, you can really see how extraordinarily fast, even before the gold rush, Melbourne was developing. The sort of funny, these are kind of the beginning of wharves there on the other side, and you can see how they're already starting to blast away the rocks at the falls, and they were forever trying to do things there to, they tried to create a dam there. All kinds of things were going on, none of which were very successful, and finally, much later on, they widened the river and all that disappeared. So this is 1854. So this is after the gold rush has begun, and you've got a paddle steamer there. And clearly, you know, these are sort of barges that were being used to carry goods up the river, but you also have a lot of little sailboats, etc. But the St. James Church is already there, and he actually designed that church. It's now been moved to a different location, but that was the first church in Melbourne, and Russell designed it. So look, this is a map that was done of the lots to be sold in Sydney. And so we're travelling all the way up the river here toward the east there, toward Warrandyte. But what I wanted to point out to you is that there's a little yellow square there on the south side of the river, and that's the native institution. So that was where in the very early stages, they tried to gather native Woiwurrung and other people to live there and to try and, you know, teach them the way of European life, etc., not very successfully. But there were quite a few people who went to school there, including William Barak, who in his writings remembered being taught by the teacher at the mission. So I thought that was sort of quite interesting too. There'll be more about William Barak later on. So this was the area where that reserve was, And this is a house that belonged to George Augustus Robinson, who was the chief protector of Aborigines and a terrible man, really. But it's quite an interesting painting in that it has, this European couple talking to an Aboriginal man, and there's a little boat on the river, and in the distance you can already see some buildings, and you can see that his house has got these vines growing down it, and there clearly sort of, been some planting going on and some farming going on. And this is by the same painter. All I know about George Gilbert is that all I found out about him was that he was 25 years old when he arrived in Port Phillip, and that he was the son of an English landscape painter. I couldn't find any more about him. So, but he's a terrific painter. I love this work. So again, you have this lovely picture of two Aboriginal people on a little boat there, and a European person fishing. And perhaps that is supposed to be Robinson's house in the distance there. So this is, there are two paintings here by John Cotton that I've used. John Cotton wasn't really much of a painter. He was actually a pastoralist and a naturalist. And he wrote the first book about Victorian birds, or the first work on Victorian birds that was ever written. It was in the Tasmanian Journal of Natural Science in 1848. And he painted this picture, which I think is just called an encampment by the Yarra. I've used it actually so many times, this image. I used it in my history of St Kilda Road, which was the first of these histories that I ever wrote. I find it interesting, the kind of shelters that they have here. The one on the left that's covered with leaves and branches, and that's obviously sort of part, the tree is used as part of that shelter. And then there's this one, native bathing scene on the Yarra, which I also thought was quite nice. And he didn't stay in Melbourne for very long, but while he was here, he did share, he did paint these very few paintings. So then we have this fantastic painting of Hoddle's camp near the source of the Yarra. So Hoddle took over being the surveyor of Melbourne from Russell, and this is at the source of the Yarra. This is a waterfall that was, after that, many times photographed. We had photography very early in Melbourne, so we were very lucky that way. But I just love this. And this is a fellow called Henry Short. All I've found out about him is that he arrived in Melbourne in 1852, and he exhibited paintings of still lifes and Aborigines in the 1850s. That's all I found out about him. So, but Hoddle was there, that he was part of that group. This is the only painting that is in the State Library or anywhere that I know of by Eleanor Glynn. 1840 in Melbourne. All I know about her was that she was enrolled at the National Gallery School between 1877 and 1879. So she would have painted this painting from some memory, or perhaps she imagined, I'm not quite sure, because this is, her depiction of Melbourne in 1840. Anyway, I think it's a lovely rendition again, very romantic. So then we're going back a little bit, and this is a series of paintings about of Melbourne and the Yarra River by Liardet, who very briefly, his little biography is that he was an Australian hotelier, watercolour artist and historian who is responsible for the early development of Port Melbourne, where he did many more things than that, but I don't have time. But anyway, this is the falls, and you can see a Mr. Lesurve's house, and this is his punt. That little rowboat was what he took people across the river in, which I think is pretty cute. This is another fabulous the swans. Apparently there was just so many swans, and I will read out something about the swans in a moment, but so that is the real first punt. and that went across just about where Swanston Street is now, and where we ended up having the Prince's Bridge. And you can see all these fluffy trees. They're all she oaks, which, you know, around the Yarra and everywhere just used to be covered in she oaks. We've hardly got any left now, but they were kind of, gum trees and she oaks were the main vegetation that we had. This is his version of John Batman's house on Batman's Hill, and you can see the river winding towards the bay there on the left. And he's, for some reason, you know, he always does these funny little things. So he's got a lot of little sailboats, the kind of lighters that were able to go further up the Yarra than, you know, after they'd passed the sort of, the river really wound a lot and was quite narrow. So you had to, if you arrived in Melbourne, you arrived in a big sailing ship, and you either then try to make your way overland from Port Melbourne, or you got onto one of these lighters, which cost, I think they cost 5 shillings or some inordinate amount of money to get from Port Melbourne or from Hobson's Bay to the inner part of Melbourne. People complained about that a great deal. So then we have a Faulkner's house, and this is just such a great rendition of everything that's going on. You've got a bunch of black swans flying in the air. You've got some emus behind the house. You've got some kangaroos. There's people cutting trees down. There's an Aboriginal man in his boat. Then, you know, it's just a very busy and sort of, I think, quite fun little drawing. This is again supposed to be Faulkner's house, and for some reason he's combined Faulkner's house with the signing of the Batman Treaty, and that is Buckley there, you know, the white man who was, you know, who was living with Aboriginal people for 30 years and suddenly appeared when Europeans arrived in town. And I don't know, he's just sort of combined everything there. He's got the house, he's got all sorts of things that didn't happen at the same time at all. I'll just read you this little bit about, this is Russell in 1836 in his diary. He wrote, "The afternoon was fine, atmosphere dazzling, and of that transparent blue which can never be painted, the deeper tones of the misty distance quieting the scene, and the dark dresses of my paddling companions sparkling and giving life to the picture. The swan eggs I have just breakfasted are delicious. One is as much as a person can accommodate. Plover eggs, which at home are considered a delicacy, are in abundance." So that's just a little snippet from Russell's writings. So this is the landing on the Yarra, and I'm very pleased to see that they had coffee and tea for sale there. So that's just kind of an interesting little note to have. So I think Andy May has written a book about coffee in Melbourne. That's probably worth having a look at. But anyway, again, a very cute little scene. And this is great. You know, he's got the Union Bank, which was actually in Collins Street, but it looks like Collins Street is right on the Yarra there because there's a little boat on the left. So anyway. And this is the flood. So already in 1849, we had a flood because part of the cause of this flood, not entirely, but part of it was that on arrival of all the thousands of sheep that arrived in Melbourne, the beautiful way that Aboriginal people had kept the ground very porous in the way that they kind of looked after the land was destroyed. And we had all these sheep and cattle just battening the land down hard so that the water had nowhere to escape. I mean, they did have floods, but not like this. Anyway, again, you know, you get this very humorous scene of horses and cattle and all kinds of, you know, the rainbow and you know, Melbourne is already quite developed. Now, I'm just going back and forth a bit. 1843 is when Georgiana McRae arrived, or actually she'd arrived, I think, already before that. But she designed this house in Richmond or Abbotsford. And there's her drawing of it. The little drawing on the left is her drawing of it. And it says it's in Abbotsford. Unfortunately, it was actually demolished in 1862. But I've got a little thing that I just want to read very quickly that her son wrote about what this house was like. Between the front of the house and the river, the slope, at first gentle, became more or less abrupt. And as this portion lay entirely among boulders my father had these dislodged at considerable labour and expense, so that in time we had proper terraces laid out for our vines, banked up with rough stones, and the interstices filled in with smaller ones, stone dyke fashion and without cement of any kind. In addition to this was a tall, broad, raised walk of stone with a rotunda like a small fort at one end. Below the terraces lay a wide slope of rich black alluvial soil, which made a fine lower garden, but subject always to the influence of floods. Along our part of the bank of the stream, as indeed both above and below us, stood a grand belt of white-stemmed river gums, many on the very brink with their roots stretching down into the water, and between these thorny myrtle tea tree of different varieties, wild hazel and dogwood, forming a thick green curtain between the garden and the Yarra. On the other hand, stout paling fences ran right into the river so that no one could pass our frontage otherwise than by boat or by swimming. So unfortunately, they weren't there very long because Georgiana's husband was hopeless and they ended up having to sell this house and move up toward Dramana. This is just a lovely little painting, Francis Simpkinson, the river at Dights Falls. You can see the building that the Dights Falls, the mill was part of here. I just, there are so many of these kind of renditions of the Yarra. I didn't find out much about him either. Did I even find out anything? I'm not sure. Here we go. Painter, diarist and naval officer. In 1845, at the Hobart Town Art Exhibition, which was the first major fine arts exhibition in any of the Australian colonies, Simpkinson showed one watercolour, which may have been this, I don't know. Anyway, so then we're moving fast toward 1851 when Victoria separates from New South Wales, and this is the celebration of the separation. And in the distance there, you can see the bridge. So finally, they've built that one arch bridge that was the first Prince's Bridge in Melbourne, and it was ready in time for this celebration. And Mr. Latrobe was there. He was by then he was the Deputy Governor, I think, not the Superintendent. Then we have the gold rush, and suddenly Melbourne is wild and mad and crazy. And as you can see, there's about 50 million ships all, well, I always exaggerate, but, there they all are at Queen's Dock. And I mean, really, people would just arrive during the gold rush period and the sailors would just abandon the ships. And so it was just really a very crowded and mad time. And again, you have western end of the Coles of Queen's Wharf, and there's a paddle steamer there. So you can see, people just kind of arriving and trying to find their way to something, not quite sure what. And then 1854, we have This is Melbourne with the One Arch Bridge, and we already have a train line, and there's a little train puffing along there. So we had the first train line in Australia, thanks to gold. And you can see all the sort of cargo. These little sheds are all there for cargo. And I think it's just it gives you an interesting point of view. You've got quite a lot of ships here. And there on the other side, you've got a little paddle steamer. So, this gives you a very kind of nice idea of what the state of the roads and how wet it was down there toward the Yarra. Really, extremely wet and prone to flooding all the time. This is Canvastown. This is where people who had nowhere else to go when they arrived in Melbourne during the gold rush lived. And apparently it was quite a dangerous place. And people, of course, people set up stores and did quite well. But again, you can see the Yarra and the bridge in the distance there. You can see some ships over here and Flagstaff Hill with the flag. William Strutt, look, I put this in because I know it's got nothing to do with the river, but I just thought this is what women were doing during the gold rush. So, you know, he made a point of drawing how, you know, because most of them had been left behind by the men who'd gone off to Ballarat or Bendigo or wherever. So they had to do all the hard work. I just love this drawing. Now, I put this in, even though it says 1894, the old brickyards, because it's good to remember that one of the things that happened on the Yarra and quite close into Melbourne for a long time, and the reason why we have those bricks at Federation Square is because they're actually speaking to the fact that we once had brickyards all along the Yarra River. And that, I don't know, you know, they were, again, very prone to flooding, and the poor fellows who worked there very often had their own houses just washed away. So 2 years after we had the flood, then we had separation and gold. And, well, in the same year, we had this terrible bushfire. And apparently this too had a lot to do with the fact that, you know, the land had not been soft burned, you know, cold burned by the Aboriginal people in the way that it had. So there was far more undergrowth and far more burnable stuff in, you know, in many parts of Port Phillip. And these were terrible fires, you know, that just reached so many different parts of the colony. This, I think, is on the Yarra, and I found this sort of quite interesting because there are kangaroos in this drawing. This was done by Julius. Oh, now I've just got to find his little Julian not Forshry. Anyway, Robert Ashton, I'll find him in a minute, but he did a lot of these beautiful engravings for various newspapers in Melbourne and in Sydney, and he was a very fine artist. So this is an interesting thing because this is 1855, Mr. Perry's farm on the Yarra. And you can really see, so this is just at Fairfield, but of course it looks very rural. You can see how extraordinary lengths, you know, this person has gone to. He's got an orchard there. You know, there are all kinds of activities going, and he had a vineyard, he had, and the Yarra is down here, you know, he's really trying to cultivate all of this ground, and he had a very successful farm, and it remained there for quite a long time. It's beautiful, a painting by Guerard, who, as we know, became one of our most wonderful, and, you know, just these paintings are so important to us because they give us the picture of what things were like. Then we already had photography, and I always found the comparison of how romantically painters painted Melbourne and how the Yarra and what it was really like. Such a contrast, you know, this kind of really quite ragged looking Yarra there. The Yarra at Studley Park, where there was already a bridge. This seemed to be a favourite spot. Studley Park seemed to be a really favourite spot. And Forshry and Daintree were two photographers who were already working in Melbourne. Forshry was from France and had an extraordinary career, so he was very much here we go. So he arrived in 1852, was a French adventurer, writer and photographer with Republican sympathies. So that's right. It's one of the important things about the gold rush is that the gold rush was just after the 1848 revolutions in Europe. So many of the people who arrived for the gold rush in Melbourne were actually quite strong revolutionaries. And Forshry wasn't a revolutionary, but he was certainly a Republican. He opened a photographic studio in Melbourne in 1858, but he went off. He was commissioned to accompany the French forces as they progressed to Beijing during the last stage of the Second Opium War in 1860. And I believe he died not long after that of some kind of dreadful disease in Yokohama in Japan. So this is also his extraordinary photograph. So this is the Yarra below the falls in 1858. Just a few years before, it had been this beautiful, clean, lovely, sort of rural scene. And here you have all these different little boats. And that's the falls there, you can see it. And this paddle steamer, just extraordinary, what is happening on the river. The Yarra in flood in Heidelberg. So the Yarra was often in flood. This was 58. Almost every year there was a flood. This is also he actually took quite a few photographs of Wurundjeri people, and they're again accessible on the State Library of Victoria digital website. But I just found this a kind of very moving, quite sad photograph. And then we go back to the romantic, this is Studley Park again, and this is Chevalier, who, again, one of these, we just had the most fantastic people arriving in Melbourne. So, he was another wonderful painter. And I just haven't got time to read everybody's biographies, but I urge you, please, to just look these people up. And we have their works both at the NGV and at the State Library digitised, so you can have a look. Again, he was also a printer as well as a painter, so you have this fantastic picnic on the Yarra. And the Yarra was already being used very much for recreation at this stage. We had such an influx of people after the gold rush. Suddenly we had a big city, thousands and thousands of people, and they really were pretty bored and needed some sort of entertainment. And the river provided many opportunities in terms of bathing boxes and boating and picnics and all kinds of entertainment. This is another lovely Studley Park, scene from Studley Park. Now, 1862, Henry Byrne. So you have here the morgue is this building here. This is the river goes underneath here, but you can see that cattle are still grazing. And this is St. Paul's. So, you really have an idea that by 1862, so this is just a few years after Melbourne is, settled by Europeans, you have a city, it's really full on. And this I also love. This is Henry Gritten, Melbourne from the south bank of the Yarra, because you can see how the river is going through here, but all of this floodplain is here. So it's still, the train, by the way, is here. I love and this is St Kilda Road, so already being used, to bring people and goods up from various places, St Kilda and Brighton, where people already had farms. And it's just, again, gives you a really good idea of how a lot of these buildings here would have been warehouses that would have been built by, all the people who were importing goods into Melbourne and exporting them. This is the same painter, Gritten, Melbourne from the Botanical Gardens. I pinched this from the Melbourne Water website. Another Von Guerard painting, view toward Yarra Bend. So this is a bit further out of town, but it shows you how there's already houses all along the river there, quite sort of intensely. This is again Chevalier, and he's just such a romantic, lovely, lovely painter. Beautiful trees and the city in the distance, and looking very European, actually. This is Louis Bouvelot. So we have another, fabulous European painter who arrived here, and on the banks of the Yarra. This is clearly someone's farm, and there's still a lot of trees, the gum trees. And this is another one of his paintings, again, very European style, but got a little bit of impressionist kind of romance about it. So this is Brandes Ferry, which is now where the Swan Street Bridge is, believe it or not. And this is Henry Byrne, Hodgson Punt. So we have all these lovely little punts, you know, that cross the river, where some of them, you know, were just a little boat. Some of them were big enough to carry a whole carriage across the river. Already by 1870, I'm just kind of going backwards and forwards a little bit here, there was already a gold rush at Warrandyte, which had happened actually in the 1850s, but there was still going on during the 1870s. So that was one of the reasons why that far up the river was already being developed, and why people were living there was because we had some gold there. But I found this very interesting. You know, the way that they sort of enclosed these sections where they were clearly looking for gold. And then already in the 1870s too, and especially in the 1880s, we have these big works happening on the river. This is at South Wharf, and this is the excavation for what is now Docklands and the channel, you know, that went down from there. So they cut out, as you can see on this map, they changed the course of the river so that we no longer had the river winding up this way, but, you know, we had this channel cut straight across so that, and the river was widened and deepened so that great, you know, larger ships could come up the river. Okay, look, I'll just go back there just to remind you that it was all done by hand. And then I've got some images which I didn't want to put here, but I've got some images of the water being let in to this part of the river too, which was quite, as you can imagine, was quite an event. Now, I've got this photograph here. This is William Barak, who I talked about before, who I said went to that little school at the mission, and he became the person who became the chief of the people who had Corandurk, who lived at Corandurk. By the time they went to Corandurk, which was in the 1860s, there were only 40 Wurundjeri people who went, but they made quite a go of that, and it lasted for quite a long time. So here he is. He's still got his dark hair here. He's here with William Howitt, who was quite an early sort of eco warrior a little bit. And I don't know, the unidentified man. But I found it really interesting that there was a photograph of them together. So there he is painting at Corandurk, and he painted many, many, many scenes of Aboriginal life that he was, you know, he wanted to make sure that we understood somehow what their way of life had been. And he was very passionate about many things. He's someone that everyone should just read about, make sure that you understand who he is. He's very important to the history of the whole country. This is one of his paintings, which again, you know, State Library Victoria and the National Gallery, you can have a look at these online and they're just superb. So this is 1876, Nicholas Kerr. He was again another one of our fantastic photographers. Rorke's Bridge between Corandurk and Healesville. So you can see what the country was like there. So this is going further upriver. And this is a scene at Corandurk. And again, you know, there are many photographs of the farm at Corandurk, which again, you know, if you want to have a look at those, you can certainly go onto the State Library website and find them. This is also a Kerr photograph, and you can see here how much Melbourne and the river had developed by this time. So this is Queen's Wharf and Flinders Street. The wharf came straight onto the street at that time, and there are many hotels, many warehouses. You can see the horses waiting there, ready for any kind of cargo that's come along. You can see what kind of life was going on. At the same time, we had the beginnings of the Heidelberg School. So this is a Charles Condor painting of the Yarra River near Heidelberg. It's in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So you really have this impressionist thing happening. And I've got quite a few images from the men and women of the Heidelberg School, because it's too important not to have them, clearly. So this is, again, Condor, and they often bathed in the river. This is their little hut that they used. This is McCubbin's pool at Heidelberg, the moonrise, and the gardener's cottage. This is actually at Como. So this is, in South Yarra, which looks so rural, but in fact, and I like McCubbin because he also did the more industrial parts of the river. So this is the Dudley Flats, which are very famous because poor people lived there during the Great Depression in their sort of shanty houses. And again, that's something that you can look at, find out. There's lots of work being written about the Dudley Flats. This is again McCubbin, and very different. He changed his style of painting so much. This is very kind of modern. So this is just Melbourne on the river. And this is a sketch of the Lower Yarra. Little dock. He painted the river a lot. And this is the mouth of the river near Williamstown, which hardly anybody ever painted. And it's not very clear, but at least you get an idea of how, sort of quite industrial it was. This is our Federation celebration that we had, and the Prince's Bridge, which is the new one with the 4 arches, was had this wonderful celebratory arch that was designed by a very famous Melbourne architect, Harold Desbrouwer-Neer. And this was what it really looked like. So just to give you a photo, of the thing. So we go back to the Heidelberg School, the artists' camp, quiet day at Darebin Creek. I think that's just beautiful. Still glides the stream and shall forever glide at Eaglemont. Evening with the bathers at Gardeners Creek. My book will also have quite a lot about the tributaries of the Yarra. This is Ugo Catani, not Carlo, who was the great engineer, but Ugo, who was the painter, Queen's Wharf. And then we have some of the women, Jane Price, who was part of the Heidelberg School, Jane Sutherland, and this is Richmond in the 1880s. Jo Sweatman. Now, Jo Sweatman was one of the first people to make her home at Warrandyte, and that's where she would have painted this. Yarra at Warrandyte. These women were really extraordinary. Clara Southern, who had a fantastic house at Warrandyte and lived there for many, many years. This is a photo of her with a kookaburra. I love this photograph. Anyway, she was really, the women were very, very strong during the 1890s, this period of painting in Melbourne. They sort of really came into their own. I know they've been forgotten about a lot now, but slowly but surely they're being put back into the picture. This is Cool Corner, she's called this, and the Bush Camp. Now, Penley Boyd, this is, his parents were, I'll just actually find what I've got written down here about. Oh no, look, I've got a page missing, unfortunately. So Penley Boyd was Emma Boyd's son, and he built this house, and it's a form of some sort of concrete, and it was the first house that was ever built like this at Warrandyte. Robin Boyd grew up here, and he was very much affected by his father's feeling for the land and for architecture, and they had a fantastic relationship with their property. Penley died in a car accident very young, but his family continued to visit this house, and his parents had a house at Yarra Glen and a farm there. So they were very much involved in the whole Yarra River scene. This is the river. And this is the old water wheel at Warrandyte, which I didn't know existed, but it did. The bridge and wattle, they were very much, this period, the painters were so much into painting the beautiful yellow wattle and this wonderful bridge at Warrandyte, which just looks so fantastic. This is his father, Arthur Merrick Boyd, the old Warrandyte Bridge, and his mother. Now, just for a complete change, this is a fellow called Frank Ernest Allen, who took photographs of the Yarra from the mouth to the source in 1909, bless his heart. And you can have a look at the whole lot again at the State Library. This is him in his very perky hat. I didn't find out anything much about him, but he's pretty dapper. This was his car that he travelled to the spots where, you know, he went to photograph. And then I've just taken a few. I mean, there's hundreds of these. So this is ships and wharves. This is a floodplain. This is the Princess Court Amusement Park. So on all that damp ground around where the art centre is now, they set up the Worth Circus and an amusement park. And you could actually do these rides where you ended up getting very wet, while you were having fun, typical Melbourne sort of amusement. This is his version of Princess Bridge, the Cremorne Railway Bridge. This is further up in the suburbs, the path on a bank. 2 rowing boats, an aqueduct. So this is rail tracks on the side of the river. So we're very much further upriver now. And again, this is that same water mill at Warrandyte that was painted by Penley Boyd. And you have the logging on the Yarra. And the reason why, for instance, Launching Place is called Launching Place is because that was where they launched the logs from on the river. And I'm not quite sure where they landed, but that was where they were launched from. So already at this time, there was a lot of logging going on, but of course not with the same dreadful saws that we have now. That's the sawmill. Rapids on the Bend. And this is, I think, that same waterfall that was painted in 1845 by Mr. Short. Looks very similar. Anyway, but you can see the beautiful ferns. So this is in the Yarra Ranges, you know, up in the mouth, the source of the Yarra. So now, sorry to sort of do this change again, but we have Jessie Trail, who was absolutely pioneer printmaker in Melbourne. She was considered by some people, and still is considered by some people, to be one of the most important artists that we have. So these are beautiful prints that she did under the bridge, and Melbourne from Richmond. And all these women all knew each other and supported each other and were really, you know, painting Melbourne and painting scenes on the river a lot. This is wool washing on the Maribyrnong. Christine Asquith Baker. I mean, you can see the quality of these is just lovely. And my favourite, Clarice Beckett, Prince's Bridge, and across the Yarra. And again, you know, I'm very happy to send you this list of artists, and you can just, you know, look them up yourself at your heart's content. This is Ada Mae Plant and Alan Sumner and Lena Bryants, who had a place called the Pink Hotel. They all lived together. There it is, the Pink Hotel there on the Darebin River, and they all painted around there. And they still were taking their kind of inspiration from the Heidelberg school that they painted as a community, and they all lived in that house as a community. Many important Melbourne, you know, and Australian painters lived with Lena Bryants. She bought the house. She had a lot of money. She was a member of the Michaelis family, so she was able to provide a great support for people. This is the river at Alphington, which I think is just fabulous. And this is her. So William Frater, who was associated with Montsalvat, they also knew the painters at Montsalvat. So you really have this kind of, and this is his portrait of Lena Bryans. It's called The Red Hat painting that I used to have a poster of in my bedroom. This is Adrian Lawler, who, oh, now this is, Adrian Lawler was a very interesting artist. He had a very, a lovely little cottage at first at Warrandyte, which burnt down and burnt all of his work in it. So when he rebuilt, he built a very modern house, but he stopped being interested in painting at that point and became a kind of philosopher and wrote a lot. But his house was, you know, really had a fantastic view. That's the view that he had from his house to the river at Warrandyte again. Now we're at Montsalvat, so we, you know, we're sort of jumping around a bit, but the Montsalvat crowd had, you know, Montsalvat had started to be settled at this point. And again, you know, I really just don't have time to go into all of the people who were there. But again, they used the river, they painted the river. That was very important that the river was there for their kind of inspiration. Now, this is a fabulous thing called Stonygrad. Daniel Vasiliev, who was a Russian painter, came here and he built this out of stones that he found on the property. This photograph is by Sidney Nolan. Sidney Nolan was very, very, very influenced by Vasiliev. And again, this is a house that's on the river. Just extraordinary, you know, sort of hand built. Okay, so this is another artist colony. This is Clifton Pugh's Dunmoochen, which, you know, he painted these beautiful paintings of, you know, after bushfires. Dunmoochen again was an artist colony on the river that Clifton Pugh bought the land, and Dunmoochen became a sort of artist foundation that's still there, so that nobody could develop this land in any way that, you know, that group of people didn't want developed. Now, this is Sue Ford, and she lived at Laughing Waters Road with her husband, who was a landscape painter, and she was there when there was a terrible bushfire, I think the same one, or perhaps it was a later one, 1965, and she told the story of how, she did these photographs later on, but she told the story of how she and a friend went down to the river to try and get away from the fire with their horse. And the only reason that they were not burnt to smithereens is because they actually got into the river and submerged themselves. Even the horse did, under the water for, you know, during that period until the fire had passed. And she did these fantastic, Sue Ford was an incredibly important Australian photographer, and she created these fantastic sort of montages of herself submerged in the river. This was her house. So it's still there. You can go and have a look at it. My friend Julia and I went to have a look at this house. Sadly, just very decrepit now, but it was designed by Alistair Knox, who was one of the great sort of mud brick pioneers of Eltham, and he built fantastic houses. So this is, you know, one of the many, and he was associated with Montsalvat. So all these people all knew each other, and in fact, Alistair Knox, he's someone who's got a fantastic website, and I urge you to have a look at it. It's kind of a diary where he talks about all of the people who were there, you know, who were living around there at that time, and, you know, the famous and the infamous, the many teachers and writers and et cetera. So, and again, you know, so this is where we're actually getting toward the end of the talk, so you'll be glad to know. This is Neil Douglas, who, again, a great hero. they were going to, at what is now the Bend of Islands community, they were going to flood the river and create a dam. And he just went into it and did everything that he could. And he actually saved, with friends, of course, the Bend of Islands from being flooded. And this is one of his many paintings. And he's got another one, which I haven't got a copy of here, which is very funny. He's got a picture of this very clear pool in the water. And he said that he was too scared to get in because he might pollute it. So I'm finishing with a completely different image. This is Mark Strizik, who photographed the Yarra River so much in the city. And this is Robin Boyd's fountain, which used to be where the art centre is now, and which was the most fabulous thing. I actually remember it. And it had water that, I can't remember what it was, but something, the amount of water that came out of it depended on some, and maybe there was music involved too or something. Anyway, so this is a fabulous Mark Strizik photograph of that fountain. And I think that's pretty much the end. I'm sorry I went so fast, but I kind of had to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, that was great. It's nice to have that perspective of the Yarra. I think it's something that isn't touched on as much as it should be. My thoughts would be, we did say that this event will go for an hour, but if it's okay with you, Judith, would you like to?
Well, if there are any questions, I'm very happy if I can answer them. You know, I know I went at about 1,000,000 miles an hour, but if I can answer them, I will.
Oh, great. Yeah, I think if anyone has any questions, it might be best to pop them in the chat or to turn your mic on and ask them.
Daisy!
Oh.
Are there any questions or not, do you think? It's all right if there aren't. I won't be offended. I really urge you, though, to follow this up, you know, to have a look at the works of these people and to understand where you live. You know, all of us who live in Melbourne or have lived in Melbourne at any time, really, you know, it's just a wonderful thing to know about where you live.
And I'd also assume, if it's okay with you, Judy, if people do have questions afterwards, if they email it through, it'll be
Sure.
forwarded to you.
Yeah, of course, of course. No one got a question?
I have a question.
Oh, Peter Barrett. So many friends. Hello.
I get my video to work probably just as well. Is this? I sort of joined you later, but is this a book you're writing?
Yes, it is. I'm working on a book that I don't know when it will be finished. It's a thematic history of the Yarra from its source to its mouth, and covering, you know, the period from, well, it'll include the natural history, geological history, and to some degree the Aboriginal history of the river. And it'll go right up to the present day, and will include, you know, sort of themes like recreation, living on the Yarra, the artists of the Yarra, industry, and then there'll also be kind of sections like the tragedies and the suicides. So all kinds of things, you know, will be covered in that. The port, I've already written a history of the port, so there'll be a very sort of short, you know, much shorter version of that. But I think the book will still be bigger than Ben-Hur and probably not quite as exciting.
I'm sure it'll be very exciting. I look forward to reading it.
Thanks, Peter.
Written.
And David Thompson, hello. So nice.
On the note of the book, we do have a question from Susan, who asks, when is the book due to be published?
Oh, yes, I'd love to know that. I reckon I've got another 2 years to go of reading and of researching and writing. And so maybe, so it's 2021, 22, 20, maybe 24, 2024. I'm sorry, it's a big book and I'm not hurrying. It's so wonderful to not have a deadline and to actually be able to really absorb everything. So I just go off on tangents. And I mean, because of, you know, I've got so much time, I'm reading everything that Mick Woiwod, who I've just talked, you know, about before, who lived at Kangaroo Ground and knows so much about that part of the river and so much of what Woiwurrung life was like on that part of the river. So I'm reading everything he's written because I've got the time to do it. And, you know, that's what I'm really enjoying about this project, is that before I start writing, I'm trying to really understand as much as I can.
And we've got a great suggestion from Janet, who says maybe you could present some of the other themes when they are further developed.
Sure, I'd love to. If you don't mind me going at 100 miles an hour through. This is already so much shorter than what I planned. Anyway, look, that's fine. I really look forward to meeting with you again when I've, you know, done the first draft of another chapter, and that'll be Living on the Yarra, and then, you know, we can have another go at, you know, having a look at the Yarra from a different point of view, because that's a fantastic area too. I mean, you know, people living on the Yarra means everyone from all the poor people who lived in barrels and upturned boats during the various depression parts of our history, to, you know, the people on the mansions, you know, on the Yarra, et cetera, and the farms and all of that. So, yeah.
I think there's a lot to cover, and I think there's definitely keen interest in it.
All right.
But I think we might call that the end of the webinar if possible. Thank you so much for presenting.
Oh, pleasure.
I'm the same as everyone else. I was just enthralled with the whole presentation.
Oh, good.
Really great.
Good.
But yeah, please, everyone that's attended, if you've got any questions, please send them through.